In most Philadelphia Eagles mock drafts, we're seeing edge rushers go off the board early, defensive tackles, safeties, tight ends. I'm going to tell you why on today's edition of Locked On Eagles. Offensive line is almost a slam dunk to be one of Howie Roseman's first 2 picks in the 2025 NFL Draft.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. I'm Louie DiBiase, your host for this Tuesday edition of the show. Whether you're listening in Philadelphia, Seattle, Washington, Europe, Australia, it doesn't matter. We appreciate you making us a part of your Monday through Friday. The 2025 NFL Draft is 1 month away. We are churning out mock drafts. Mock draft after mock draft after mock draft on this podcast. I see it all over Eagles Twitter as well. It is mock draft season. And as I said, most positions that I'm seeing with the Eagles' first 2 picks, 32nd overall, 64th overall, it's defensive tackle, it's edge rusher, the best player available from those positions that fall. It's moving up for a safety like a Malachi Starks. Nick Emenwari right now, the South Carolina safety, I think is the favorite mock draft to the Eagles right now for most platforms. At least that's been the trend, the trendy player prospect of the week. You've been seeing some tight ends, especially in the second round, Gunnar Helm, Mason Taylor, Elijah Arroyo. But one position I'm not seeing in a lot of mock drafts, including my own, because a lot of times my mocks are infused with bias from myself and what I want the Eagles to do, even if I say that's not what the objective of that mock is. It definitely seeps into there a little bit. But I do think we should be seeing more mock drafts that have the Eagles taking an offensive lineman with one of their first 2 picks. It doesn't have to be the 32nd overall selection, but I do not think this year's draft is going to be like 2024, where Howie goes an entire day 1, an entire day 2, and you don't see him take at least 1 guard or tackle. Like, that's what he did last year, and it was very weird. It felt very different. Normally, you don't see Howie Roseman draft back-to-back defensive backs with the first and second picks that he has in the first 2 rounds, and then he takes Jalix Hunt in the 3rd round, which wasn't surprising. That's an edge rusher, and he normally goes with the trenches, but you normally see Howie take an offensive lineman pretty early in drafts, especially if there is somewhat of an immediate and long-term need, and they headed into the season not really knowing what to expect from Tyler Steen, or heading into draft season, I should say. They didn't have Mekhi Becton yet. They signed him after the draft. They also still didn't know how long Lane Johnson was going to play. So the fact that they didn't draft an offensive lineman early in that draft, considering those circumstances, was a bit surprising. But at the same time, I think a lot of it wasn't based on preference, even though they wanted to add defensive backs. I think the fact that they didn't take a lineman in the first 4 rounds was more just a matter of circumstances with how the board fell. I mean, you look at the first round, there was a run on offensive linemen in that first round right before the Eagles picked, which, in fairness, though, a silver lining to that was it allowed you to get Kenyon Mitchell to fall down the board right into your lap. But there was an offensive line early in the first round. There was an offensive line run as well in the second round. I remember looking at a guy like Roger Rosengarten from Washington, who ended up getting taken by the Baltimore Ravens, and I was saying to myself, if he's gone at that point, there's not a lineman that I want in this round. It's time to focus on other positions. We know Howie Roseman, of course, had his sights set on Cooper DeJean. He trades up the board, but I do think if there was a good offensive lineman that was within striking distance of a trade-up or did fall down to one of the Eagles' original picks with those first 4 selections, he would have took one earlier than round 5 when he selected Keegan. So for me, I think this year you can, and especially again when you enter the right guard situation exactly the same as you did in 2024. Yes, you extended Lane Johnson, but the Eagles like to bring in that heir apparent in a quicker fashion than I do. Like, they like to be more proactive there than I would originally prefer. I think there's a really good chance the Eagles, I think it's almost a guarantee with one of those first 3 picks in the first 3 rounds. And maybe it's most likely it's one of the first 2 picks. The Eagles do select an offensive lineman, whether it's a starting right guard or it's a tweener to start at right guard now and eventually replace Lane Johnson, whether it's just a tackle backup to wait behind Lane Johnson and be that swing player, which I think is stupid, but I do think the Eagles will likely take that approach with one of their first 3 picks. Again, depending on how the board falls, but I don't think there's any way they don't select a lineman in the first 4 rounds this year, and there's a really good chance it's with one of your first 3 picks. And again, I do say all the time on this show, I think drafting a Lane Johnson replacement right now that wouldn't have guard tackle versatility would be a bad use of a really good resource of an asset like a first or second round pick or even a third round pick. I just really do not like redshirting first round picks, especially for, if it's more than 1 year. If it's 1 year, I can get behind it, I guess, but even then, I don't like to do that. I don't really believe that there's a lot of value to a guy sitting on the sidelines and quote unquote learning. So for me, I wouldn't go with a tackle in one of the first 2 rounds if he can't play right guard. Lane Johnson just got extended through 2027. He's showing no signs of slowing down. I just, again, think a rookie contract is very, very valuable to have a guy that's playing well in the field, that's inexpensive for 4 to 5 years. That's a really good asset to have on your football team that I don't want to waste in the form of a red shirt. So I wouldn't do this unless they had guard tackle versatility. And that is one move I could get behind. And the Eagles really do like this style of bringing up a prospect to replace a veteran, this mentorship program, if you will, that they've been running since 2022 to transition from, one core to the next, where these guys can learn from all-time greats. Like Kenyon Mitchell can learn from Darius Slay. Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter can learn from Fletcher Cox. Even to a degree, Nolan Smith and Jalix Hunt can learn from Brandon Graham. Cam Jurgens can learn from Jason Kelsey. Jordan Mailata can learn from Lane Johnson and Jason Peters. I like this idea, this mentorship style, where, yes, a player does get to learn from those all-time legends. I do think that's invaluable experience. It's priceless to, what Kenyon Mitchell was able to learn from Darius Slay, I'm sure will help him for the rest of his career. And same with Cam Jurgens and Jason Kelsey. What Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis learned from Fletcher Cox and what Nolan Smith and Jalix Hunt learned from Brandon Graham. But again, like I said, when they're sitting on the sidelines not playing, I don't think that helps a player's development unless they're just extremely raw, and it would hurt them more than help them to be out there if they're just going to be there's bust potential all over that player. But normally, most of the time, I think they should be out on the field. The Eagles have been able over the last few years to have their cake and eat it too, where they're developing these players. They don't have to be stars right away because you have those stars on the field that are veterans, but they do get to be starters or at least role players to a degree and get that experience on the field. I like having that middle ground. So, no, if the Eagles draft a tackle in one of the first 2 rounds and they do kind of like what they did with Andre Dillard in 2019, where he can't play guard and he is a backup for, 2 to 3 years? No, that will be a mistake. Because Lane Johnson, even if he retires, let's say, I think the earliest he could retire is after the 2026 season. He signed through 2027, so he's at least going to play 2 more years. He could play 3, if not more seasons. Like Jason Peters played into his 40s. We have no idea where Lane Johnson's head's going to be after 2027 or his play style. Yeah, you want to be proactive and have a guy ready to go at such an important position. But again, I'm not redshirting a player unless I know he's a starter. I will not draft a player in the first 2 rounds unless I think there is a very, very good chance he's a starter within a year or 2. Wasting 3 years of a player's contract or 2+ years where he's not playing a lot, and especially on the offensive line where it's not as rotational as the defensive line, I don't love that idea. But there are some players I do think could be brought in to be that eventual right tackle replacement, but for now can play right guard and then slide over, like Cam Jurgens did, playing right guard in 2023, sliding over to center in 2024. I think there's 3 guys to really keep a close eye on in this draft in the first 2 rounds. These are guys that are projected to be, I would say, late first-round picks, more likely early second-rounders. Josh Connerly Jr. from Oregon, Josh Simmons from Ohio State, and Jonah Savanea, from Arizona. Josh Connerly Jr., Josh Simmons, Jonah Savanea, they're tackles traditionally, but a lot of their traits transition well to right guard. They're powerful, bigger players. I think Jeff Stoutland could prefer that style after losing Mekhi Becton at right guard than the smaller, more compact player like a Tyler Steen. And look, I love Tyler Steen. I think he's a good player. I think he's going to be a good starter in the NFL when he's given the chance. I said last year I didn't want the Eagles to even take this approach of a right guard, right tackle tweener because I wanted them to give Tyler Steen a chance. I still would like them to give him that chance this year. I have confidence in him, but I have more confidence in Jeff Stoutland. I have more confidence in Jeff Stoutland than I do in Tyler Steen. And if Jeff Stoutland, for the second year in a row, brings in yet another player that has more upside than Steen and replaces him as the starter, I'm not going to second guess it because it worked last year with Mekhi Becton. And they're already kind of thinking that way with that trade for Kenyon Green of the Houston Texans. Kenyon Green, I think, has a much lower floor than Tyler Steen, but he has top 15 overall upside. There's a reason Houston took him with a top 15 pick. So they're already kind of taking that approach again, and it makes me think they're likely not still fully on board with Tyler Steen as the right guard. So I'm more in, because of my belief in Jeff Stoutland, I'm much more in on the idea of drafting somebody like Connerly Jr. or Simmons or Savanea, because I don't think he believes as much in Tyler Steen as I do, and I trust Jeff Stoutland. I think he's the greatest offensive line coach of all time. So who am I to doubt him when I think offensive line, to be totally frank with you guys, is probably my biggest weakness from an evaluation perspective. I know more about the other positions than the offensive line, like what makes a player great. Like watching tape, my eye is not for offensive linemen. Jeff Stoutland's, there is not a better eye for offensive linemen in the history of the NFL. So I think it's very likely that with probably one of the first two picks, but I think you can guarantee it in the first 3 or 4 rounds, that the Eagles, Howie Roseman, Jeff Stoutland, they are going to get a versatile right guard, right tackle player to eventually have the potential to replace Lane Johnson, but for now could push Tyler Steen and Kenyon Green as that starting right guard. Maybe they're even a slam dunk to start there if it's like a first round pick. If they take this route at 32, I think they're going to start in 2025. So I think we should see more mock drafts in April than in March that include the offensive line for the Eagles with one of their first 3 picks, and I'm definitely going to have that approach myself in future mock draft Mondays. I don't want a standalone right tackle to sit for years. Lane Johnson is not retiring anytime soon, but if you want to bring in a guy that could eventually be that replacement and for now can play right guard, even if you just took a right guard in a vacuum in the first or second round, I think having a high-level guard on a rookie contract is worth that pick at that position. But if you add on that he could potentially also be Lane Johnson's replacement, I think that's a win-win. So I'm on board with that for sure in one of those rounds. All right, guys, coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast, it's hard to hit on a 32nd overall pick. To hit on a draft pick late in the first round, the hit rate there's a drop-off percentage-wise after the top 20. I'll tell you what the right approach should be for that pick coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. All right, today's episode of Locked On Eagles is brought to you by FanDuel. March Madness is here. FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. I've got my eye on a few underdogs in this bracket still. FanDuel makes it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. The FanDuel app is simple to use, and when I win, I get paid instantly. No waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com, get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. All right, so picking 32nd overall, not ideal, although it is ideal because it means you won the Super Bowl. But from a draft perspective, it is hard to hit a lot of the times on these late first round picks. Like, it's not easy. Howie Roseman has had a track record of missing on a lot of these picks. You look at, and this is the first version of Howie Roseman, the GM, part 1, before Chip Kelly, axed him. Marcus Smith, he took in 2024, late in the 20s of that first round. Derek Barnett in 2017, he took in the middle to, later part of the first round. Andre Dillard in 2019, Jalen Reagor in 2020. This was Howie Roseman's weakness for a while. But lately, picking a player late in the first round and not trading out of the round, it has gone better for him. Like, he took Nolan Smith. He stayed put at pick 30 in 2023, and Nolan Smith had one of the best Super Bowl runs of any Eagle last year. Kenyon Mitchell, another player that fell to the Eagles outside the top 20. The Eagles just said, we're going to stick and pick. We're going to take Kenyon Mitchell. He was a Rookie of the Year finalist. So the last two drafts, picks beyond the top 20, they have worked out for the Eagles. But like I said, it's not easy. A lot of times you're going to see there's positional runs, that go right in front of you and you just kind of miss out on certain spots. Certain draft classes are just weaker in general. So some drafts, it feels like it's loaded at the bottom of the first round. Some drafts, it's like outside of the top 15 to top 20 players, is there another guy that has the potential to be a blue chip prospect that's worth a day one selection? Some years that's just not there. This year's class, it's very deep on the defensive line. I would say on the offensive line as well. It's really good at running back, though. The Eagles don't need that. I think it's pretty good at safety as well, but it can get slim in other spots, which could allow a lot of linemen to go early, and that's what the Eagles need, and suddenly they're left with the crumbs at 32. So it's not easy. How should they approach? Like, what is the key to hitting on these late first-round picks? What should be the Eagles' approach here? Well, for starters, you don't reach. Like, if there isn't someone worth the pick, then trade back, if you can. It does take two to tango. Sometimes, if there isn't anybody that's worth picking for you, odds are the other teams see that as well and don't think there's somebody worth that pick. But everybody's bored. Everybody's evaluation process is different. If you don't feel like there's someone that's really worth a top 32 pick and it's not close, like if there's a guy that's in the 33 to 40 range, I think you could justify it. But let's say that like there's just nobody left that you think is worth that pick, and it's going to feel like a reach even to you. You got to try to trade back, because especially in this draft, a lot of these mock drafts I've been doing, the difference between player X at 32nd overall and player Y at 45 overall, I don't think there's a really big drop-off. Like between, let's say, Donovan Ezereku of Boston College and Princely Umanmielen from Ole Miss, is there really a massive drop-off between those two? Is there a huge drop-off between Walter Nolan and Kenneth Grant and Darius Alexander? Not really. So I do think one key picking this late is to not reach and to trade down, try to collect more draft capital, because odds are there's not a massive drop-off with that other pick you get in the second round. So I think, to me, trading is the key to not reaching. Trading up or trading down is normally the smart call when you have a pick where the Eagles do in the 30s. And you look at, like I mentioned, runs happen in the NFL at certain positions. There is going to be runs on pass rushers in this first round. There will be runs on offensive linemen. To me, another key is when you're picking this late, when you see a run happen, you either get in or get out. You get involved in that run, you trade up to try to get one of those prospects before they go, or you get out of the first round, like I said, and you trade down. Don't take the leftovers unless it's like a really loaded class and there's 15 players here that we like. Maybe 8 or 9 go off the board. We know one's going to fall in our lap, but sometimes that's not the case, and you'll be able to project that. Howie Roseman is very good at projecting what the league is going to do. He's very good at predicting the board. I think that's one of his strengths. He'll know likely where these picks are going to go, what players are going to fall where. Runs happen, though. I think another key, trading up or down, like that is the key. Don't just sit there and take the crumbs unless it is a really loaded class. And even though this is a loaded pass rusher class, there's been a lot of mock draft simulations that I have where everybody goes, because again, the other positions it's loaded at defensive line, but it's not loaded at other positions. So there's still a scenario where none of these guys do drop. And that's where you get into trouble, is where that's like, I'm a draft for need guy, but that's where you get into trouble when you force a need at a late first round pick after a run where there really isn't a prospect worth taking there, but you do it anyway because you feel like you got to take somebody and you need that position. That's when you get into trouble, is when you take a position, but the player that's at that pick, that value, there's just not a player of that value there. So I think the key is just not forcing it. Trading is your best friend. But at the same time, if you are going to stick and pick at that spot and you have no choice, like let's say there's just nobody to trade with, I like taking the risk on guys with upside. Guys that have traits, even if it doesn't work out, I think when you're picking that late, I'm cool with that. I'm willing to live and die with a player that has a high ceiling, but not a high floor. I also do get the idea of going just straight best player available there based on your needs at 32. If you can't get out of that pick and there's not a whole lot of players you like there, go BPA based on positions you need. I think best player available is the right approach in this scenario as well, whereas like higher up in the first round, taking a need is not a bad thing because I don't think it's going to be a reach at most positions. Most positions are going to have players worth taking inside the top 15, inside the top 20. So I think that's another thing. Go for upside, go for the BPA based on your needs. But also, I like taking the risk on players who fell, even if there is a good reason for why they fell. Take a chance on a guy that, yes, like I said, there's a lower floor. There might be some concerns off the field, or you don't know what position he's going to play. There's certain traits that he does or doesn't have, some things on or off the field that he has or doesn't have that made the NFL drop this guy. But if there is the potential that he could be a blue chip player, even if there are those concerns, I like taking the chance on one of those guys. Like that's the best case scenario. If you can't get up the board, if you don't trade down, you got to hope for somebody to fall. Like Kenyon Mitchell last year, that's what I'll say is, not to discredit Howie Roseman, but you know, who he was picking outside the top 20 was Nolan Smith and Kenyon Mitchell, who were seen as consensus top 15 selections the majority of the draft process in both of those off seasons. So that's the biggest key, is hoping that a guy falls to you at that pick. And the Eagles have been lucky that 2 years in a row, a player that had no business being available at that spot was available, Nolan Smith and Kenyon Mitchell. So that's the key. But at the same time, it's hard. It is hard to get it right at the end of the first round. A lot of times, these are second-round talents that come with day one first-round pressure. And that's tough. That's the tough reality, is a lot of these players are more likely second-round talents that you have to take in the first round for one reason or another. And first-round picks there's an added pressure to get that first-rounder right. So the Eagles do have it's a difficult spot to be in at 32nd overall. Of course, you want to be drafting there every year because it means you won the Super Bowl. But, in a vacuum, where the spot they're in is not ideal. But Howie Roseman's very good at these situations. I imagine he will not make that pick at 32. He'll likely trade up or trade down. But you never know. 2 years in a row, he has just stuck with the pick and made a selection. But I think that's the right approach, is you hope somebody falls, you definitely trade up or trade down. If not, you go for the upside. You go for somebody that has a chance to be a blue chip player, best player available based on positions of need. All right, guys, coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast, our second time doing our new draft segment, Prospect versus Prospect. I'm going to spin the random name of prospects and debate who I think the Eagles would be better off taking with the 32nd overall selection if it was down to these two players. So we'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. All right, so every Tuesday and Thursday, we are doing Prospect versus Prospect right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast, where I have 10 different prospect names on a random wheel of names. And we're going to spin it twice. One prospect's name is going to pop up. Another prospect's name is going to pop up. We'll debate if the choice was between these two players in the first round. We'll eventually do the second round. Some different scenarios. If you were trading up for one of these guys or trading down, who would you choose? We're going to stay at 32nd overall again today, and we're going to let's spin this wheel and see what prospects we'll debate between who the Eagles should take with that 32nd overall select. So let's see here. Our first spin, we have Matthew Golden, the Texas wide receiver, the burner from the Longhorns, ran a 4.29, I believe, at his pro day. Matthew Golden is on the clock at 32. Let's see who we're debating Matthew Golden with. Mike Green, the Marshall edge rusher. So the debate for prospect versus prospect is Texas wide receiver Matthew Golden versus Marshall edge rusher Mike Green. For me, I'm going to be in the minority here. I think the majority of Eagles fans would say you select Mike Green. He's the better prospect at a more valuable position. It's a position that you need much more than wide receiver. Mike Green's a productive player. He had 17 sacks in 2024. He wrecked the Senior Bowl. I think he's an explosive player off the edge, really good bend, like a consistent motor. He's a good tackler. Like, he's a good player for sure. I think he's talent-wise one of the top 5 best edge rushers in this class. But why I'm taking Matthew Golden is there are 2 different allegations of sexual assault to Mike Green, and that's concerning. That's too much for me to handle. For me, I would avoid that, especially in a deep class. If I'm Howie Roseman, and it's between these 2 players, and I think this is a likely scenario. Mike Green, because of these off-the-field issues, could very well plummet down the board in the first round. It sounds like, this week's reports are there are teams that are concerned about it. And everybody's, process with this off-the-field kind of stuff is different. And we talked about this kind of stuff with the Eagles a couple years ago with Jalen Carter. Not that were the allegations with Jalen, but, those off-the-field concerns, everybody's process is different. Everybody's judgment is different. But I think he could be in that range at 32. Again, in a vacuum, if that wasn't part of this equation, yeah, you take Mike Green over Matthew Golden when you have Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown and, for now, Dallas Goedert, and you have Jahan Dotson and Saquon Barkley. Like, this offense is definitely not barren of weapons. But for me, I would take Golden just because I think that's too much. That's too much of a distraction. That sounds too risky for me with Mike Green, especially in a deep class of edge rushers where I have alternative options. Mike Green might be a little bit better than Donovan Ezereku or Shamar Stewart or Nick Scorton, but I'm going to take one of those guys that don't have those concerns off the field. And Matthew Golden, in a vacuum, I don't hate that idea. Like, yes, is taking a receiver over an edge rusher the smartest use of that 32nd overall pick? Likely not. Is it smarter than taking a defensive tackle or, like I said, a right guard or potential right tackle replacement for Lane Johnson, or heck, even a tight end to replace Dallas Goedert? Probably not, but it's not as crazy as it sounds. Like, Matthew Golden could make a big impact on the Eagles, especially in a scenario where Dallas Goedert is not here. Yeah, of course, you could replace him with a really good deep tight end class and draft a Colston Loveland or Elijah Arroyo, Harold Fannin, Gunnar Helm. But maybe the Eagles say, hey, we just need 3 legitimate passing targets. He doesn't have to be a tight end. What if he's a receiver? And we want that niche role of a sub 4-3 burner that can take the top off a defense. That makes it even more challenging to load the box on Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley. That makes it even more challenging to focus in on A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. Like, having that kind of, and I like Dotson a lot. I think he's going to be really good next year in year 2. But Matthew Golden is a niche player that has that like deep threat, that burner home run hitter role that the Eagles, again, they have a bunch of deep threats, but they don't have that style of player, that burner, that 4-3 speed guy who can also help you in the return game. I was watching his tape and I couldn't believe how good of a contested catch guy he is for his size. I think you could run a rotation with Golden and Dotson in the slot, or have them play on the outside when Smith and Brown are rotating in, and boom, like, there is your like passing target replacement for Dallas Goedert. Like, I don't really hate that idea. And Dotson's only on a one, he's got one more year left of his deal, and I can't imagine the Eagles are going to pick up his 5th-year option. So they could use a 3rd receiver long term next to Smith and Brown. I don't think it's the craziest idea. If, again, there's the scenarios that played out to get to this pick, it would have to go really bad where just every tackle on the offensive and defensive line are gone. Emin Worry and Starks are gone at safety. And, like Jahad Campbell's gone at linebacker. And nobody wants to trade with the Eagles for that 32nd pick. I can't imagine there's a realistic scenario where they go with Golden. But if that scenario played out and they did make the pick, I don't hate it. I really don't hate it. And Jalen Hurts is one of the best deep ball throwers in the NFL. He loves to push the ball vertically. This offense is better when they're being aggressive and taking shots. Last year, when the passing offense was inconsistent, they weren't taking enough shots downfield. Adding Matt Golden can help you even more in that area, and if you lose Dallas Goedert, that's a lot of deep, explosive yardage, not just down the field, but run after the catch ability. You can probably replace him with a tight end. That's the likely scenario, but maybe they say, let's just add another receiver. We're going to spread this thing out, run a lot of empty sets for Jalen Hurts. We could run some 4-receiver sets. We can rotate Dotson and Golden. Those are your third and fourth targets in the passing game, and boom, we move forward. I don't think Golden will even be there at 32, but if he fell, I'd have to give it some thought. This was my same logic for last year talking about Xavier Worthy in this way. It's not going to happen, but in this scenario, prospect versus prospect, Matthew Golden versus Mike Green, again, Mike Green is the better player at a more valuable position. It's a bigger area of need, but the off-the-field things really concern me with him, and there's too many other alternative options at the edge for me to take that risk. So that's why in this scenario, I'd go Texas wide receiver Matt Golden. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks for making us your first listen each and every day. Make sure your second listen is the Locked On NFL Draft podcast with Keith Sanchez and Damian Parsons. They get you ready for the draft, talking about all these prospects Monday through Friday. Thanks as always for downloading, watching, and listening, and let's go Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.